Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we have been hosting the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven for over 35 years. And so we're really happy to be back this spring. This spring, we're taking a closer look at World War II. We have a wide variety of lectures on this topic. Some things I'm sure you've probably heard of before, and others maybe you haven't. Maybe today's lecture is one of them. So we thank you for joining us today. Today's presenter is Ashley Barnes-Gilbert. She's a lecturer in women's and gender studies. She's a historian of women, gender, and sexuality in the United States. Her research explores brothels and their role in turn-of-the-century Southern and Midwestern river towns. She received her PhD from the program in Gender and Women's History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as the George L. Massey Scholar of LGBTQ History. Ashley teaches a wide variety of courses at UW-Whitewater, including Introduction to Women's and Gender Studies, Feminist Theories, Women, Race and Ethnicity, and Women and Work. She has expertise in women and gender history and race and ethnic history in the United States. Please welcome Ashley Barnes-Gilbert.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Can everyone hear me all right? Hopefully good. Wonderful. It's great to be here. As Carrie noted, we've had some interesting weather, and so y'all are actually one of my first lectures of the semester because we haven't had classes very often yet at Whitewater. So here we are. I'm excited to do this today. When Carrie contacted me about a potential lecture on World War II, I thought it was an interesting opportunity to do something maybe new for y'all that you haven't heard before. I could have given you kind of the typical lecture on Rosie the Riveter and talked about women in the war, which is really fascinating stuff, and I can always come back and do that later if you want. But I thought this might be fun to kind of give you a bit of a glimpse into some people's lives that don't tend to get talked about when we look at history. So for social and cultural historians, World War II has always marked a key moment in American history. Beyond being a politically and economically influenced war, World War II also reflected several social schisms in American society. The stress of the war and the need to fight the war successfully resulted in moments of societal expansion. For example, women were able to get jobs in the factories, many factories for the first time, as were people of color. There was increased access to service in the armed forces and also other portions of American ideals during the period. Some of these stories might be familiar to you, such as the story of Rosie the Riveter and the opening of factory labor to women across the country. Or perhaps the Tuskegee Airmen, the African-American military pilots who fought during World War II. All of these moments just demonstrate the societal expansion of World War II and how, for social and cultural historians, the war caused a lot of societal change. But one group that's often not talked about when it comes to this time period are the lives of gay and lesbian women. So today I'm going to talk to you about gay men and lesbian women and their experiences both in the war with the expansion of kind of societal norms and also the contraction of those norms to prevent the rights of gay and lesbian persons in particular. Several scholars have worked in the last 30 years or so to recover the lives of gay and lesbian men and women and tell their stories, particularly their stories during World War II. They wanted to recognize the erasure of their lives is highly problematic, and making them invisible results in a larger narrative of the war that is not complete because it does not explore some of the major social changes that resulted from this time period. Today, I'm only going to have a chance to give you a glimpse into this narrative. Obviously, 35 minutes isn't enough time to give you the full historiography on this topic. But I hope that you can kind of get a good feel for how the war worked during this time period for gay and lesbian persons and for veterans, and retelling the story of World War II. To start, I'm going to do what every good historian is going to do, which is give you some historical context, particularly on the concept of sexuality. I'm a historian of sexuality, so I often talk about how sexuality is socially constructed and the way that it's understood and changes over time and place. As the history of gay and lesbian lives during World War II indicates, sexuality is socially constructed, and how it is understood, identified, or targeted reflects the time period within which a person lives. Prior to the 19th century, most societies understood sexuality quite differently than we do today. In the US today, we often assume that sexuality is an inherent and personal reflection of the self. The individual has a sexual identity, and that identity both categorizes them and reflects a deeply individualized set of feelings regarding both sexual acts and desires. Yet this concept of sexual identity was actually an invented one. The term homosexual was first coined by psychologists who wanted to demarcate a category of persons as deviant, not just them, their sexual behaviors, but them as a person themselves. The treatment of same-sex sexual activities by the US government during wartime demonstrates a shift in views about sexuality. From the Revolutionary War to World War I, military officials would only penalize homosexual acts, such as sodomy or oral sex between men. Thus, the armed forces did not have a specific policy of exclusion, nor had the armed forces ever discharged a homosexual prior to World War II. In part, this lack of policy was due to the lack of the concept of a sexual identity. The idea of a sexual identity became more salient, starting among psychiatrists in the late 19th century. And as the psychiatrists began to define a sexual identity, they also began to define ways to root out people they saw as being deviant and not belonging within American society or the armed forces. In terms of the history of American wars, psychiatrists are the most significant source in understanding the change in how the, quote, homosexual was viewed by wartime officials. Notably, there are several religious, cultural, and scientific sources that offer a different narrative, but the influence of psychiatrists on World War II policy merits a closer look at their contribution to the construction of sexual identity in the US. In the 1860s, Western European psychologists began exploring same-sex desire and activities. The first time this was published and talked about was in 1862 when Karl Ulrichs described what he called the male urning. This is a man who was sexually attracted to other men, and he believed that laws that were incriminating these men who were engaged in same-sex sexual activity needed to be abolished, and this category of person needed to be recognized as a human being, not as a deviant. By 1869, Karl Maria Kurt-Benny coined the term homosexual in Prussia to challenge the laws preventing same-sex sexual activities between men. Both of these earlier adopters of the category, however, show a marked difference to a larger goal of, quote, curing the homosexual within the psychiatric community. As the term emerged, so did the desire to start trying to change the way that people express their sexual desires and how they were viewed in the world. Although it's a topic for a different lecture, it's important to note that American scientists studying homosexuality began to argue that homosexuals were a distinctive and defective type of person. This type of person needed to be located, treated, and cured, and that was part of the larger social purity movement starting in the 1890s. By the time of World War II, this camp of psychiatrists had become quite powerful within the ranks of the armed forces. Today, I'm going to cite for you several different major scholars on the topic. One of those is Alan Barabay, who wrote a really famous book called Coming Out Under Fire. And in this book, he talks about the dramatic change in policy towards gay and lesbian persons and how they viewed them as being deviant and in need of removal from the armed forces, at least prior to Pearl Harbor. Alan Barabay writes, "In World War II, dramatic change occurred. As psychiatrists increased their authority in the armed forces, they developed new screening procedures to discover and disqualify homosexual men, introducing into military policies and procedures the concept of the homosexual as a personality type, unfit for military service and combat. A concept was to determine the military policies for decades after the war. Their success in shifting the military's attention away from the sexual act and to the individual had far-reaching consequences. It forced military offices to develop an expanding administrative apparatus for managing homosexual personnel that relied on diagnosis, hospitalization, surveillance, interrogation, discharging, administrative appeals, and mass indoctrination. This policy is something that we're going to talk about today because they were still able to keep most of this in place during World War II. And to clarify, this was quite distinctive from previous wars, in which administrative officials would punish someone if they were engaged in a same-sex sexual activity, but would never claim that that activity actually reflected who they were as a person. By World War II, they created the category of the homosexual and said that if you engaged in those activities, you were also a deviant human being. That had far-reaching consequences, not only for your wartime service, but also how you're perceived in the post-war period, which we'll talk a bit more about today. Notably, however, the bombing of Pearl Harbor changed the military's need for manpower. So this initial policy, which was one of utmost exclusion, had to change. Specifically, due to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the armed forces threw out many of the previous exclusionary policies for service in the armed forces. In particular, this included throwing out the racist and sexist and homophobic policies, where they had to become a bit more inclusive in who they allowed to serve in the armed forces, including people of color, women, and LGBTQ-identified persons. They needed manpower quickly, and that necessitated the institution of the draft and resulted in one of the most diverse group of individuals ever assembled for U.S. service. Citing Alan Barabay's coming out of fire, this is the breakdown of the military during World War II. Most soldiers were unmarried white men. 4% or 700,000 service members were Black. 350,000 were Mexican American. 275,000, or about 2%, were women. 30,000 were Japanese American. And in the selective service, which was a portion of the draft, 48,000 were Puerto Rican, 19,000 indigenous, and 12,000 Chinese American. Notably, there is no such data collected in the number of gay men and lesbian women who joined the armed forces during this period. It's a consistent problem when it comes to doing the history of sexuality, particularly the sexuality of gay and lesbian persons, because we often do not see them in our records, including the census. So historians have tried to kind of uncover what they think was the amount of number of people that were gay or lesbian identified during this period. Barabay actually takes the work of Alfred Kinsey. If you're familiar with Kinsey, he was a very famous psychologist and biologist and sexologist from the 1940s and 1950s. He created the Kinsey scale, and he was well known for doing several interviews during the World War II period with people about their sexual behaviors. Based on his analysis, most historians agree that there was probably about 650,000 to 1.6 million male soldiers who were likely homosexual during World War II. It's quite a significant number of people whose stories and experiences have largely been erased and not discussed as part of the legacy of the war or the consequences of the war. For gay and lesbian Americans during World War II, a battle brewed for them internally. The battle was to either serve their country versus the fear of being labeled a homosexual, discharged, or worse during the service. Many knew that if they wanted to serve, they would have to figure out how to navigate a system that did not want them to be part of the service, and they would have to hide who they were in some fashion. In spite of this battle, many chose to serve and were not simply drafted into the war. And their experiences changed not only their lives, but also this nation. Within the historiography of both the history of sexuality and World War II, Alan Barabay's work advanced the seminal scholarship of John D'Amelio and demonstrates the significance of World War II to gay and lesbian lives. This is a text I highly recommend, so if you are someone who enjoys history, this might be one you can pick up. It's based entirely on oral histories of gay and lesbian lives during World War II. And today I'm going to bring forth several of those stories so you can kind of hear what they talked about and how they explained their own experiences during the war. Barabay, in this book, argues that the war changed the coming out process for gay and lesbian persons during World War II. Rather than live quiet and hidden lives where they might never act on sexual desires with persons of the same sex, or be shunned to urban enclaves for survival and community, homosexual men and women were thrust into single-sex environments forged for the success of the war. As Barabay and other scholars have argued, World War II relaxed peacetime social constraints, allowing for greater explorations of love, sexual desire, and friendship. Even the stress of serving in the armed forces was a factor in the emergence of more, quote, out homosexuals during this period. And to survive the war, men and women turned to one another for psychological and emotional support. These types of connections and behaviors were strictly prevented in most places in the United States. With the exception of a few urban enclaves, gay and lesbian persons lived their lives in the closet for the most part. World War II changed that, sometimes by choice, but mostly through the expanding anti-homosexual policies that forced people out of the closet through discrimination. And the combination of this discrimination and expansion of social norms transformed the armed forces and the nation, setting the nation up for a revolution in gay and lesbian rights. To tell you this story in a manageable fashion, I'm going to share with you one oral history from a service member for each topic I'm going to cover. Although it's not comprehensive, I hope you'll forgive me for that. This is just a glimpse into the rich history that we have that's often been invisible and can still be invisible if people don't tell their stories about this. We're going to start with a story of Robert Fischer and how he joined the armed forces. Notably, for gay men during World War II, getting into the armed forces required navigating the complicated but somewhat blinded system of psychological detection. Upon recruitment into the armed forces, recruits had to undergo different physical and psychological screenings. Rumors emerged that gays and lesbians were being turned away, but how was unclear. How could a psychiatrist identify the gay or lesbian recruit? Do they have special tools or skills to find the homosexuals among the bunch? Such fears greatly plagued potential recruits, especially those who longed to join the armed forces. For example, Robert Fischer desperately wanted to be part of the armed forces. He wanted to avenge his cousin's death, who had died at Pearl Harbor, and he heard that he could join if he could figure out how to trick the Army psychiatrist. He describes his interview with him. Carefully planning to hide his homosexuality from Army examiners, Fischer was surprised when the psychiatrist merely asked him, "Do you like girls?" To which he responded with a truthful, "Yes," because he recalled 40 years later, "I liked girls." Fischer wondered why the psychiatrist hadn't figured him out. My God, he thought, couldn't he see my curly platinum blonde hair that was partly bleached? The walk, maybe the sissy S in my voice, all the things that I thought would give me away? Notably, Fischer went on to be awarded the Bronze Star for his bravery during his service, and he was one of the many soldiers who liberated Dachau. His experience with a psychiatrist, however, indicates a broader issue with the call to root out homosexuals from the armed forces. This issue includes the inability to determine a person's sexuality based on appearance. For the armed forces, this would be an issue that both plagued their leaders and caused great harm to the gay and lesbian identified men of World War II. Importantly, men were not the only ones who served in the armed forces during World War II. Women were also there. And importantly, there was a distinction in the treatment of gay men versus lesbian women in the World War II. In part, this was because there was a need to ensure that those women who were serving in the armed forces not only appeared to be patriotic, but inarguably feminine. So there was a great fear that if there was any news that lesbians were serving in the armed forces, that this would undermine the image of these new women who were serving in World War II. World War II was the first time that women served in the U.S. military in an official capacity. Although women were excluded from military service and their participation in the armed forces was not promoted at the outset of World War II, it soon became apparent that their participation was necessary to win the war. Beginning in December of 1941, 350,000 women served in the United States Armed Forces during World War II. They had their own branches, including the Women's Auxiliary Corps, or WAC, the Women's Air Force Pilots, or WASP, and the Women's for Accepted for Voluntary Military Service, or WAVES. Women also served in the Marines and in a branch of the Coast Guard called SPARS. About 70% of the women who served in the military during World War II held what was called traditionally female jobs. They worked as typists, clerks, and mail sorters. Although these jobs may have been less glorified than those of the men fighting on the front lines, women were essential in maintaining the bureaucratic mechanisms that are necessary for warfare. By filling these office jobs that would otherwise be held by men, women freed more men to fight. Women were not permitted to participate in armed conflict, but their duties often brought them close to the front lines. And one way that women participated in the dangerous work was through their work in the Army and Navy Medical Corps in particular. Historians Elaine Tyler May and Lillian Faderman both note that the fledgling experiment of women in the armed forces hinged on publicity. Thus, rather than overtly root out lesbians in the armed forces, military officials and American leaders often swept instances of lesbianism under the rug. Here's an interesting example from Nell Johnny Phelps. This is an experience that I found fascinating. It was an exchange between her and General Eisenhower. She talks about how lesbians often had more freedom than their male counterparts, and even whenever she was told to root out lesbians from the armed forces, many of the leaders backed down once she talked them out of it. Here's one exchange. In 1947, she was told by General Eisenhower, "It's come to my attention that there are lesbians in the WWII. We need to ferret them out." Phelps replied, "If the general pleases, sir, I'll be happy to do that, but the first name on the list will be mine." Eisenhower's secretary added, "The general pleases, sir. My name will be the first, and hers will be the second." Phelps then told Eisenhower, "Sir, you're right. There are lesbians in the WWII, and if you want to replace all the file clerks, section commanders, drivers, every woman in the WWII detachment, I'll be happy to make that list. But you must know, sir, that they are the most decorated group. There have been no illegal pregnancies, no AWOLs, and no charges of misconduct." Eisenhower dropped the idea. In other oral histories, Phelps went on to indicate the high number of lesbians in WWICs, indicating a distinction in treatment between gay men and lesbian women by the armed forces. Eisenhower and other leaders, however, did not want to bring publicity to these high numbers, and thus usually they had a more lax policy in both admitting lesbians into the armed forces and in discharging them for illegal behavior. For Phelps and others, this meant more freedom to explore and understand themselves, apart from the typical social constraints of the period. It also meant that as historians, we only have these oral histories to really understand the number of lesbians within the armed forces and their experiences. There is no quantitative evidence to support Phelps' claims, but both groups tell us that they tried to belong and survive the war through several tactics, such as community building, finding love, and fighting the war itself. We're going to start with the issue of community building. Notably, gay culture even infiltrated Army life during World War II, most notably through the practice of GI drag. To boost morale and encourage further recruitment, all-male reviews during this period became quite common. The most famous might be one that you're familiar with, and that is the review by Irving Berlin called "This is the Army." The stage production of "This is the Army" is recalled as a blur of synchronized khaki uniforms and hundreds of male soldiers singing patriotic slogans and indulging in innocent horseplay. This is a nice image of it. Much of the review did function on that simple level, but there was also more to it than that simple morale boosting. Through his songs, Berlin managed to inject human touches that made life in the armed services comprehensible to the civilian audience. Nowhere did he accomplish this more than with his song, "This is the Army, Mr. Jones," in which hapless inductees described how the war had altered their lives. Alan Barabay argues that "This is the Army" set the stage for normalizing GI drag, resulting in these types of reviews becoming quite common and normal on naval ships and base camps. And the highest recruited members of the reviews tended to be the gay men who might have had previous experience in dramatic enactments. Although the overly effeminate men might be harassed, performance in these shows, they were able to express themselves in a far more diverse fashion than they were often allowed in peacetime society. And as a result, gay men in World War II often found the drag shows to be a haven of expression and community building. Other gays and lesbians during this period found community while they were on leave, particularly as they were able to go to the cities for the first time. Notably, World War II uprooted millions of young men and women from across America. As a result, many of them entered the armed forces, having rarely seen a big city or been exposed to much diversity. Importantly, there were several havens of gender and sexual diversity in major American cities prior to World War II, and the war exposed more and more young gay and lesbian people to those spaces. One service member named Jean S., and she does not give her full name, in the Women's Army Corps, talks about how she socialized with both homosexual and heterosexual women all the time. She describes her commanding officer. My commanding officer turned every head at the Boston Army base. 5'6", curly blonde hair, cute as can be and a smart cookie. She played around, but she had a partner in Georgia. There were women in the detachment I knew were lesbians. There was no question in my mind, but we never spoke about this. You just didn't at the time. You just wouldn't make any reference to it. We would socialize together, both straights and lesbians. And those who did identify as lesbian, the post-war period offered a chance for them to move to the cities for the first time. The female worker had become more normalized, and as several scholars argue, this helped form a lesbian subculture, particularly in urban cities, most specifically San Francisco. There are also several stories of service members who found love with the same sex during World War II. These stories demonstrate not only the resiliency of love in the face of war, but also how these service members navigated the armed forces and their rejection of homosexuality. Here's one example from Rita Laporte. Rita Laporte writes of being in the Army in 1943, where for the first time in her life, she fell in love. When the other woman was transferred to a different base, Laporte decided that the only way to rejoin her was to sacrifice all on the altar of love by admitting she was homosexual and therefore getting booted out of the Army. After reciting her well-rehearsed confession to the major, she awaited her fate. The major smiled. In a kindly voice, he said, "You're kidding. I don't believe you." I was stunned. Naturally, I had rehearsed all of the major's possible answers. I was ready to hang my head in deepest shame, to bear up under all insults, to weep or not weep, as might be necessary. Something was terribly wrong, as I blurted out, "But I am one." We argued, I pleaded, but it was useless. I could not convince him. Men in same-sex relationships often suffered a worse fate than women. As I will discuss later, the punishments meant to be a deterrent of homosexuality during the war often focused largely on men, and the consequences were usually much greater for them. This is highlighted in a more recent British love story between two men, Gilbert Bradley and Gordon Boucher. You might have seen this story as it has made its way through the New York Times and CNN and other places, in which the letters between these two men have emerged and shown that they fell in love, a great, passionate love. They didn't emerge until Bradley's death in 2008, and his family decided to release the letters. Their love story indicates both how men fell in love with one another during the war, the hardships that they faced together, and the invisibility of that love once the war ended and peacetime social constraints returned. Historians, for the most part, focus more on the love between women than they do between men. This could be the result of a lack of sources or a gendered understanding of love, or probably both. Either way, most of the stories about love that I found to retell you were about women and not about men. But if you want to look at some inspiring stories, I do recommend the story of Gilbert Bradley and Gordon Boucher. It's tragic what happened to them and their love, but it's also beautiful to see what they fought for. Notably, many of the gay and lesbian recruits and service members I talked about fought quite valiantly in the war. Alan Barabé recounts the makeup and psychological experience of male soldiers fighting in the war. He cites several studies from the period, and he notes that most wartime soldiers were reluctant to kill. About 1 in 4 actually saw combat. And most importantly, the gay men who served in World War II were no different than their heterosexual counterparts. The stereotype of the gay GI obscured the reality of the many gay men who were sent to the fighting fronts. They served in combat zones in all branches of the military as riflemen, field artillerymen, tank drivers, medics, signal corpsmen, intelligence officers, war artists, members of bomber and fighting control squadrons, gunnery officers in aboard destroyers, cryptographers, members of amphibious forces, and in numerous other capacities. Like their buddies, some were bad at being combat soldiers, and others received medals for their fighting skills and courage. I found this quote to be quite salient because the distinction between the heterosexual and the homosexual soldier was nothing more than how they were treated by the armed forces themselves. Both were humans, both were fighting quite hard to win the war, both experienced violence and death and saw many hardships, and some were good at their job and some were not. Again, that distinction between them is only how they were treated. And as the war went on, the armed forces became more and more focused on trying to root out those they deemed undesirable. In fact, when soldiers were deemed undesirable because they were considered homosexual or caught in the act of same-sex sexual activities, they underwent a vast and expansive process of discharge. About 10,000 gay and lesbian men and women experienced this process. Most of them were men. And here are a few of their stories. Many of them experienced different tools for exposure, usually through interrogations and other forms of psychological violence. Sexual humiliation was one of the chief tools of interrogators. When they discovered or thought that they had caught a homosexual, they would bring them forward to make sure that they engaged in a very harmful interrogation process. One was called the naked truth. A gay infantryman talked about it. He said what they do is they make it horribly embarrassing. He wrote to his buddy. He was interrogated on board at a disposition board at Camp Livingston, an infantry replacement center in Alexandria, Louisiana. This is a center where soldiers were sent if they were deemed in need of psychological aid or for the process of being discharged. One of the boards that he experienced placed him and other victims on a block. They made them strip, and in front of a table full of assorted colonels and majors, made them answer the most intimate questions. He called it, as did his buddies, the slave mart. He said that they would interview them while he was nude, give them questions that were quite personal, and engage in many accusing and disgusted looks. Such humiliations could make gay suspects feel as if they were the enemy or were a piece of garbage to be thrown away, and were often quite contrary to the larger discussion of what the purpose of World War II actually was. In his letter to his friend, this one gay infantryman said, "It felt as though they wanted to throw me away. How do I recommend I be disposed of? Gas, firing squad, waiting with chains and casting into the sewage canal? I'm bucking for cremation. I've been burned up so many times in the past 2 years that it would be a pleasure to be burned up once and feel it." This quote is one of many which shows the extreme emotional and physical hardships that occurred within the armed forces if you were determined or thought or suspected to be gay or lesbian. Other places that we saw this were on what was often called the Queer Brig. This was actually a naval ship that was docked off outside of New Caledonia, where they would send any suspected homosexual to engage in a lengthy interrogation process. Interrogators would often use the good cop, bad cop routine to break down their potential suspects. One of those stories is from Dave Barrett. He talked about how he was taken from the brig into an office. And there, both the judge advocate and a lieutenant worked on Barrett while yeomen took notes. They began the interrogation by telling him about his family and his former employers. This was intentional. They wanted him to know what they knew about him, particularly that they could expose him. Barrett writes, "My God, how did they learn all of this? They scared the hell out of me." Then the judge advocate threatened him with criminal prosecution. During a break in the interrogation, the lieutenant took Barrett out to a station wagon, and they sat there. The lieutenant put his arm around Barrett, and he said, "For the good of the service, you should go." And I said, "Well, if you feel that way, and I've done something wrong and it hinders the service, I suppose I'll go." He said, "You go in and you tell them that." So he softened me up. Back inside the office, Barrett agreed to talk once he got assurance that nothing would happen to anyone he named. He named 2 men. On his confession, Barrett had to sign that he was not under duress, that he was not coerced, and the judge advocate looked at him after he signed and said, "For Christ's sake, I didn't think he'd break so easy." "That hurt terribly," Barrett said. He was heartbroken, and he was lied to. Both men that he named were also rounded up, interrogated, and discharged. The interrogation can also take very embarrassing sexual turns. This is an example from a 24-year-old woman who was a corporal, and she was being interrogated at Fort Oglethorpe. And there they tried to use essentially a sexual line of questioning to try to break her down and embarrass her. They talked about what kind of pleasures she might have experienced with sex, and they had a female officer come in and ask her very personal questions about her relationship with another woman. This is just a snippet, and it's the least kind of offensive portion of it. They asked her, "Are you and Lieutenant Foster closer than just friends?" The officer asked the corporal. "No, ma'am," she replied. "I think a lot of her, but we are just close friends." "Are you in love with her?" "No, ma'am." "Is she with you?" "I don't think so." "Which one of you first made love to the other one?" "We don't make love to each other, ma'am." The interrogator then went on to explain that she understands what women do and that it's okay. She tricked her. Continually went on and asked her very detailed questions about their physical behaviors, which if you want to know more about, I can show you later, but I thought it probably wouldn't be appropriate for the group. And once they caught her in the act of having sex with a woman, they then brought the male interrogator back in. He threatened her, told her that she was going to tell everyone in WAC. He was going to tell her brothers, her sisters, her parents, and even the Baptist minister she had grown up with, unless she signed a confession and took a Discharge 8. She did, like many. Signed confessions were the suspect's ultimate act of surrender and the prize of an interrogation. A typical signed confession was composed by the interrogator after the questioning ended. Fred Thayer notes that he signed a confession that were not even his own words. They were dictated to him. And the confession actually often they're supposed to verify consent, but in fact, you can see from the confessions that they reflect military language and are often very awkward. Here's one from a sailor who was interrogated at a naval air station in Jacksonville, Florida. "I have, since March 15, 1943, attended 6, quote, gay parties at Jim Bell's home. Jim Bell was at the time a civilian and as present a private first class in the U.S. Army. I've also attended 2 parties at Doris's, a quote, dyke, living in Jacksonville, Florida. And on several occasions, I've been present at quote, gay parties, which were held at the Mayflower Hotel in Jacksonville, Florida. By gay parties, I mean those parties were attended by sexually perverted individuals and were usually held on Saturday nights with practically the same crowd present. I have seen Bob Smith, Bob Knowles, Stan Caselli, Doug Marks, Lieutenant Burke, Richard Gianni, Buddy Wilson, Steve Dunn, and Manuel Miranda. All but the last are serving in the U.S. Navy. The others are serving in the U.S. Army. Drinking, singing, dancing, and playing of suggestive records occurred at the parties, with the exchange of kisses upon greeting one another. These types of confessions were common. They don't read like someone's actual personal confession, but are clearly written by someone who is trying to name names. And if a person would produce this confession, the task of the interrogators would be to round up the persons named and continue the process of interrogation, confession, and discharge. The threats of the confessions would be used to charge suspects with criminal offenses. They were told that was what was going to happen. But in fact, the gay and lesbian men who were under interrogation were not being held there for criminal prosecution. So this was, again, another lie used by the Army interrogators or the military interrogators to try to get increased confessions from those that they perceived to be gay. Many broke down under this questioning and did not know that they were not on trial. And as a result, if they did sign a coerced confession, they would undergo what was known as a Section 8 discharge, or more popularly, a blue discharge. So it's used also against African Americans, and it was not necessarily an honorable or dishonorable discharge, but it was meant to indicate in the case of someone who was homosexual that they had a mental illness. More than 5,000 homosexuals were released with Section 8 discharges from the Army and more than 4,000 from the Navy. Importantly, the Section 8 discharge had significant effects for a potential soldier who wanted to leave or was forced to leave the armed forces. Margot Kennedy talks about this in The Straight State. She notes that for lesbian women, these discharges essentially meant that it became difficult for them to ever return home after they left the war because they'd be labeled as being lesbian and thus not welcome back in their homes. For the men, it had a significant effect on what benefits they could obtain after World War II, including access to health care at a VA hospital, access to the numerous benefits of the GI Bill, including not being able to get college tuition, occupational training, mortgage insurance, and loans to start businesses. Notably, Those things, particularly the GI Bill, are something that's highly celebrated about World War II, seen as being one of the great ways that the country was able to start over after the war and create a burgeoning economy. But for gay and lesbian persons who had been rooted out and discharged, this was not their reality. A Section 8 discharge often meant that the former service member was unable to ever get a job again in civilian life. Thus, for many historians, World War II not only changed the contemporary sexual order, but also set the stage for a greater gay and lesbian rights advocacy. Here are some of the legacies of World War II when it comes to the lives of gay and lesbian service members, and for the community in general. For the lives of gay and lesbian men and women, World War II had both positive and negative effects. On the productive side, World War II brought the experiences of the gay and lesbian person out of the shadows. Prior to the war, social constraints kept gay men and women often invisible, often hiding their desires in fear of being punished. This perpetuated the myth that people like them didn't exist. They were locked in a closet of lies and deception. Many people with homosexual desires were mistakenly believed that they were the only ones in the world who felt that way and had no idea that there were others like them or what to call themselves. The war changed this. The mobilization of the war helped loosen the constraints that so many gay people in silence, that so many people lived in silence, isolation, and self-contempt. It also created a language for how we understand sexuality today. The categorization of homosexuals as a personality type by wartime psychiatrists began to transform how American society viewed sexuality. In fact, the hardships of that gay and lesbian service members experienced brought them closer together. As Barabay notes, after the war ended, U.S. cities saw a proliferation of gay bars, the broadening of public discussion of homosexuality, the formulation of the idea that homosexuals constituted a minority, the widespread acceptance of the psychiatric model of homosexuals as sexual psychopaths, the emergence and growth of federal anti-homosexual policies and bureaucracies, and the opening of new avenues through which gay citizens could appeal government injustices against them were some of the many legacies of World War II. In fact, as World War II ended and the Cold War began, the U.S. underwent both a massive witch hunt for homosexual identified persons and a burgeoning gay and lesbian rights movement. Under the era of Joseph McCarthy, the U.S. government supported the rooting out of potential communists from the government, from universities, and from Hollywood. Importantly, Joseph McCarthy and others believed that homosexuals were just as big a threat as communists, even linking homosexuality and communism in certain cases. This resulted in increased persecution of gay and lesbian identified persons during this period. One great book on this is by David K. Johnson called The Lavender Scare. He notes that in 1950, many politicians, journalists, and citizens thought that homosexuals posed more of a threat to national security than communists. By looking beyond McCarthy and behind the ambiguous term security risk, his study reveals that a lavender scare, a fear that homosexuals posed a threat to national security and needed to be systematically removed from the government, permeated 1950s political culture. The purge ended careers, ruined lives, and pushed many to suicide. But it also resulted in a burgeoning gay and lesbian rights movement. The increased persecution, combined with growing communities supported by the visibility created during World War II, resulted in gay and lesbian persons beginning to fight back. Some fought back through what we call the politics of respectability. They created what is known as homophile organizations, like the Daughters of Bilitis or the Mattachine Society, whose sole purpose was to tell outsiders that gay and lesbian persons were respectable American citizens. Others fought back by taking over spaces for themselves, creating more gay and lesbian bars and tools for survival, including surviving police raids. Some of these raids resulted in greater protest, including the famous Stonewall riots of 1969. Thus, by the 1960s, gay and lesbian persons were fighting for equity and inclusion in American society. They fought for the declassification of their identities as a mental illness. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association did change that diagnosis and actually removed it in 1986 from the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. Gay and lesbian persons also fought for increased visibility, equitable health care, especially in the face of the 1980s HIV/AIDS crisis, inclusion in the armed forces, marriage, and continuing fights through this day. These battles reflect World War II, in which the U.S. is being asked to continually expand and change those who are included and treated equitably within American society. Ultimately, today's talk was meant to give y'all some insight into the struggles of gay and lesbian persons during World War II and beyond. These struggles indicate that American history has not always provided equitable retellings of all Americans. Gay and lesbian history often faces an uphill battle, seeking both to find that history in the archives and create a shared history despite distinctive identities and experiences with sexuality in different times and places. But overall, I thought I would end today's talk with one of my favorite quotes about history from my graduate school advisor. Why do we narrate things the way we do? Certainly people have marshaled history to discipline bodies and justify violences and purifying purges. But with our histories, we also create portals and connections and communities across time, a possible antidote to alienation and abjection. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
And here's lots of citations for you. So if you are interested in further reading, there's several, some scholarship for you to look at.
Great. And we do have time for questions. All right, let me come around there with the microphone.
Oops. The statistics you showed during World War II, the 600,000 to 1.6 million,
Yes.
is that a percentage which is similar to what we're aware of now? And that would give some validity to that statistic.
Yes. So I'm trying to think if most stats are hard to come by when it comes to trying to quantify gay and lesbian communities. And that's because right now they are not quantifiable within the American census. So they're not being asked that in the census. So we don't have clear evidence. So I think it ranges according to who you're talking to, kind of what you see between like 2 and 10%, right? That you might see in terms of the population. If we can ever get that included on the census records, it would definitely change what data we have available to really understand kind of the LGBTQ community in our society. It's a great question. Nothing right now. It's just kind of all by word of mouth. And as you might imagine, it's quite hard to know because people will stay in the closet for fear of retribution. There's not as much visibility. It's obviously changed in the last 60 years or so comparatively, right? But it's still an issue, right? And we still don't see it in terms of kind of visibility in this. Yeah. So I think there's multiple different reasons why people want it in the census. One is just visibility, right? So the idea that someone can be named as part of a community and that they matter as part of that community. Others might say that it has importance for archival purposes. So looking at trying to how we can understand a group of people, right? So for example, just kind of give you anecdotal evidence as to why this might be important for historians. I study sex workers, and sex workers are also not codified in the census, right? So for me to do my work, I have to usually read kind of between the lines in the census, and if they label a job, figure out what they're saying that job is, right? Similarly, for gay and lesbian persons, they are invisible in that census, right? Some might argue against it, not wanting to be identified in that fashion. Yeah.
You're not asking heterosexual people if they're sexually active. So why would you do that? You're not saying to this man or this woman, are you heterosexual? And are you active? Are you having sex? You're not saying that. And that's just what heterosexual would be doing by labeling them homosexual.
Sure. I think the argument would be that right now, currently, is that we're presuming that everyone is heterosexual by not asking someone's sexual identity in the census. And that's a larger problem of kind of heteronormativity, right, where we assume everyone is heterosexual when they're not actually, right? And so that's kind of the argument against it. I think that there's different positions on both sides of it. As a historian, I think having data would be really useful. So that's my position on that one. Yes.
Okay. Let me know if I'm missing you, okay?
On the radio this morning, I heard that there is a bill being introduced in Madison about prostitution. Are you familiar with that, and what is the situation?
I'm not actually, so I apologize. I'm not up to date on my recent news, so I don't know what the bill says, and I cannot effectively speak to it at all. Yeah. Do you know if it? I honestly, I have no idea. It's
It,
going to be.
it was Andre Jacques. I heard it this morning too.
Okay.
That's the person who is, and it was some sort of extra fee or something that they were charging. It kind of is a bigger issue with human trafficking. Is
Okay. So it's kind of a trafficking
Yeah.
bill. Got it. All right.
Oh yeah, over here.
It's interesting how one person can say this is deviant behavior and changes the lives of millions of people.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really frightening to kind of see the power that certain institutions had during this time period to kind of name a group and then try to root them out and its effects, right? And I often have long conversations with my students about this, right? About how we can look at these institutions, how they functioned over the last 20th century, and if they want to take on the identities, right, of those categories that have been named by these psychiatrists in particular, right? A lot of power.
Just one other sentence. How come heterosexuals don't have to come out?
Excellent question, right? Again, that's reflective of heteronormativity, right? Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
You started with the history.
Mhm.
How come the United States didn't accept the English? They had all kinds of laws about homosexuals, and how did we miss that? We were enlightened.
So do you mean like prior to World War II?
Yeah.
So there was different rules, right, depending on each state, and usually the laws had to do kind of with like each country with actual like kind of sexual behaviors that they would try to root out. But in the 19th century, kind of across the Western world, no one really believed in the idea of a sexual identity, right? So today, right, we will identify as being heterosexual, homosexual, or something else, right? But in the 19th century, people didn't do that, and instead they talked about their desires, right? But they were never labeled something as a result. So the rules were different in that way. And then as a historian, right, it also means that we can't necessarily understand the full gender and sexual order of, let's say, the 19th century, because it's quite different than it is today, right, in terms of kind of what was acceptable and what's not. Yeah. Other questions?
Any other questions? Okay, well, let's leave it there. Dr. Barnes-Gilbert can answer individual questions, I'm sure, if you'd like. And remember, next week's lecture is on FDR World War II speeches, so don't come expecting literature, okay? But today, let's thank Dr. Ashley Barnes-Gilbert for an excellent lecture.
Thank you all so much. It was great to be here.